By the time the interview ended, Nikki Haley would stand from her chair, remove her microphone without asking permission, and walk off the set while the cameras were still running. One number would follow her out of that studio and haunt every future appearance she made. $800 million. What made her leave? What question could possibly strip a former UN ambassador, a former governor, a woman who had spent decades in the most hostile political environments imaginable, of every defense she had carefully constructed? You're going to want to hear this. January 14th. A Tuesday morning interview slot on a major network's political program. Nikki Haley arrived 20 minutes early, as she always did, her team carrying the usual materials, prepared talking points, recent polling data showing her favorability among independent women, a leather portfolio containing her standard credentials recap. She had done this hundreds of times. She knew how these segments worked. Friendly questions about her presidential campaign, opportunities to position herself as the reasonable conservative, the chance to distinguish herself from the chaos of Trump while maintaining credibility with the base. Standard political theater. She settled into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone who owned these spaces. The host opened with the expected pleasantries, thanked her for coming, mentioned her new book. Haley smiled warmly, crossed her legs, touched the small American flag pin on her lapel in a gesture her media trainers had specifically workshopped. Then came what she assumed would be a softball setup about her qualifications for national leadership. The host mentioned that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett would be joining the segment remotely to discuss Haley's record as UN ambassador. Haley's smile widened slightly. She leaned forward just an inch, the physical tell of someone who has just been handed an advantage they did not expect. "I welcome the Congresswoman's perspective," Haley said, her voice carrying that specific condescension successful women sometimes deploy against younger women they view as inexperienced. "Though I would note that she's been in Congress for, 2 years? I spent 2 years negotiating with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. I think the American people can judge whose experience better prepares them to understand foreign policy." She paused for effect, let the comparison breathe. "But I'm happy to educate anyone who wants to learn." The split screen appeared. Jasmine Crockett sat in what appeared to be a congressional office, a single yellow legal pad visible on the desk in front of her, a pen in her right hand. No notes, no portfolio, no prepared documents visible. Haley registered this immediately, and something in her posture relaxed further. The younger woman was unprepared. This would be easier than expected. "Congresswoman, thank you for joining us," the host said. Crockett nodded once, her expression professionally neutral. "Ambassador Haley just mentioned her experience at the UN. Would you like to respond?" "I appreciate the ambassador's willingness to discuss her record," Crockett said quietly, her voice carrying none of the edge Haley had deployed. "Because I have some questions about it." She picked up the legal pad, turned it so a single column of numbers became visible to the camera. Specifically about the $800 million. Haley's smile remained fixed, but her eyes moved to her press secretary, seated just off camera, a micro glance, seeking confirmation that this was expected, that they had prepared for this. The press secretary's face showed nothing but confusion. Whatever Crockett was referring to had not been in any of the pre-interview negotiations about topics. "I'm not sure what specific figure you're referring to," Haley said smoothly, pivoting to the standard deflection. "The UN budget is extraordinarily complex, and as ambassador, I work to ensure American taxpayer dollars were spent responsibly. We actually reduced certain wasteful programs significantly during my tenure." Crockett set down the legal pad with unusual care, the way someone might handle a photograph of a crime scene they were about to enter into evidence. "Let me be very specific then," she said. Her tone had not changed, still quiet, still measured. But something beneath the words had shifted into a different register entirely. "During your time as UN ambassador from January 2017 through December 2018, you gave 47 speeches, interviews, or official statements in which you claimed that the United States reduced its financial contribution to the United Nations by more than $800 million under your leadership. You called this, and I'm quoting from your September 2018 speech at the Heritage Foundation, the largest reduction in UN spending in the organization's history achieved by American leadership. Is that accurate?" The question was so straightforward, the tone so free of accusation, that Haley answered before her media training could catch up to the shape of what was happening. Yes, that's absolutely correct. It was one of my proudest achievements as ambassador. We finally held the UN accountable. Crockett reached off camera and lifted into view a blue folder, the kind available at any office supply store, with a white label on the tab. She opened it without theatrics, simply turned to a marked page, and began reading in the same measured tone. United Nations Financial Records, publicly available, fiscal years 2017 and 2018. Total assessed contributions from the United States to the UN regular budget in 2016, before you took office, $596 million. Total assessed contributions in 2017, your first full year, $598 million. In 2018, your final year, $607 million. She looked up from the document. Ambassador Haley, if we reduced our contribution by $800 million, why did the actual budget documents show we paid more? Haley's hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, moved to the arms of her chair. Those figures don't account for the peacekeeping budget, she said quickly. The savings came from peacekeeping operations, which is a separate line item. That's where the reductions occurred. I'm glad you brought that up, Crockett said, and now she reached for a second folder. This one read, already open to a tabbed section. UN peacekeeping budget, same period. U.S. assessed contribution to peacekeeping in 2016, $1.2 billion. In 2017, $1.18 billion. In 2018, $1.21 billion. She looked directly at Haley through the camera. That's a reduction of $20 million over 2 years, followed by an increase that canceled it out. Where's the other $780 million you claim to have saved? The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. Haley's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Her press secretary was now frantically typing on a phone, presumably trying to pull the same UN documents to find the discrepancy, to locate where the $800 million figure had originally come from in Haley's talking points. The host glanced between the two women, uncertain whether to interrupt or let the moment resolve itself. The savings were achieved through multiple mechanisms, Haley finally said, her voice slightly higher than it had been, the first crack in the professional veneer. Budget caps, voluntary contributions, operational efficiencies across multiple agencies. You can't simply look at one line item and claim to understand the full financial picture. Crockett turned a page in the red folder without hurry. You're right that it's more complex than one line item, so I pulled all of them. Regular budget, peacekeeping, voluntary contributions to UN agencies, UNICEF, WHO, refugee programs, capital master plan contributions, every single category where the United States provides funding to the United Nations. She looked up. Would you like me to go through each one, or would you prefer to revise your claim about the $800 million? Haley uncrossed her legs, recrossed them the other direction, a physical reset that failed to reset anything. I stand by my record, she said, but the words came out defensive rather than confident. The Trump administration held the UN accountable in ways previous administrations refused to do. I'm not asking about accountability, Crockett said, her voice still carrying that same dangerous calm. I'm asking about a specific number you've used in 47 public statements to claim credit for savings that don't appear anywhere in the UN's financial records, the U.S. State Department's appropriations reports, or the Government Accountability Office's analysis of UN funding during your tenure. She paused. Let that sink in. That's not a question of interpretation. That's a question of whether the number is real. The camera on Haley's side showed her in profile now as she turned slightly away from the split screen toward her press secretary, a silent plea for intervention. The press secretary had nothing. The documents Crockett was citing were public record, which meant they were verifiable, which meant there was no procedural objection to make, no way to claim anonymous sources or partisan framing. Let me help you, Crockett continued, and something in her voice suggested this was not an offer of assistance, but the beginning of something worse. She reached off camera again and this time lifted what appeared to be a thin stack of paper, perhaps 15 pages clipped together. These are transcripts of your Heritage Foundation speech, your American Enterprise Institute keynote, your Fox News appearances in October 2018, January 2019, and March 2019, after you'd left the UN, and 6 other venues where you specifically cited the $800 million figure. She flipped through the pages, sticky tabs marking specific sections. In each case, you described it as verified savings. You used phrases like documented reduction, confirmed by UN accounting, and in one case, independently audited. So my question is simple. If this was documented, confirmed, and audited, where is the documentation? Haley's face, which had started the interview composed and confident, had transitioned through annoyance into something approaching genuine distress. The color had risen in her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice had lost the smooth, practiced quality entirely. I received those figures from career staff at the U.S. mission to the UN, who compiled them from internal UN preliminary reports that don't always align with final published budgets because of the complexity of multi-year appropriations and carryover funds, and the difference between assessed contributions and actual cash flow and— Ambassador Haley, Crockett interrupted, the first time she had cut in, and the quiet force of it stopped Haley mid-sentence. That was a lot of words to avoid saying you can't produce the documentation you claimed existed. 11 seconds of silence. The studio audio picked up someone coughing off camera. Somewhere a phone buzzed. Haley stared at the camera showing Crockett's feed, and Crockett stared back, her expression unchanged, waiting. I would need to go back to my records, Haley finally managed. Your records from when you were ambassador? Crockett asked. Yes. What records you had access to when you gave those 47 speeches claiming documented savings? Haley said nothing. Crockett set down the clipped transcripts and picked up the legal pad again, turned it toward the camera. The visible column showed a list of dates and venues, each with a check mark beside it. I want to show you something else, she said. This is a timeline of major financial claims you made during your career. June 2012, as governor of South Carolina, you claimed your administration had created 38,000 new jobs in manufacturing. The South Carolina Department of Employment and Workforce later revised that number to 12,000 and noted that most of those were created before your term began. You never corrected your public statements. She turned the page. August 2014, you claimed South Carolina had the lowest unemployment rate in the Southeast under your leadership. At that exact moment, Virginia, Georgia, and Tennessee all had lower rates according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. You repeated the claim for 6 months. Another page. March 2017, at the UN, you claimed the United States was covering 22% of the entire UN budget, and it was unsustainable. The actual US share at that time was 17.8%. You were off by 4.2 percentage points, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that represents hundreds of millions of dollars in misrepresented contributions. Haley's press secretary was now standing, moving toward the host, clearly about to intervene procedurally to claim time limits or contractual agreements about scope, anything to stop what was happening. But the host raised one hand slightly, a gesture that said, "Not yet, let this play out." So, here's what I need to understand, Crockett continued, and her voice had remained in that same register throughout, never raised, never sharp, but absolutely relentless. This isn't one mistake. This isn't rounding up for rhetorical effect. This is a pattern spanning more than a decade of your career, where you consistently, publicly, and repeatedly claim credit for economic achievements, spending reductions, and policy victories that are either significantly exaggerated or, in the case of the $800 million, completely fictional, according to every available record. She leaned forward slightly, the first change in her physical posture since the segment began. And what bothers me about this pattern, Ambassador, is that you don't just use these numbers in speeches to friendly audiences. You use them in presidential campaign materials. You cite them as the foundation for your credibility on fiscal responsibility. You build your entire public identity around being the competent manager who delivers results, except the results keep turning out to be numbers you can't document. Haley's hands gripped the chair arms hard enough that her knuckles showed white. Are you calling me a liar on national television? I'm asking you to produce documentation for claims you said were documented. Crockett replied immediately, her tone unchanged. If that feels like being called a liar, maybe that tells us something. The host finally intervened. Ambassador, do you want to respond to the specifics about the UN budget figures? Haley turned to face the host directly, away from the split screen, as if removing Crockett from her field of vision would remove the problem. This is exactly the kind of gotcha politics that Americans are tired of. Taking complex budget issues, stripping away all context, and trying to score cheap points instead of having a real conversation about America's role in international institutions. I brought the full context, Crockett said quietly. 5 folders of it. Would you like me to keep going? For the first time, the camera caught what Haley had not intended to show. Genuine fear. Not the managed concern of a politician facing a tough question, but actual fear that this was spiraling beyond any talking point's ability to contain it. Her eyes went to the folders Crockett had referenced, now visible stacked at the edge of the frame, and something in her face changed. Actually, I think I've given you enough of my time, Haley said abruptly. She reached for the small microphone clipped to her lapel. Ambassador Haley, we have 12 minutes left in the segment, the host said, surprise evident in their voice. I have another commitment, Haley said, which was transparently false given that her schedule had been cleared for the full hour, a fact her own press secretary had confirmed in pre-interview emails. Her hands fumbled slightly with the microphone clip, the smooth practiced gestures that had opened the interview, now replaced with jerky urgency. Before you go, Crockett said, and something in her voice made Haley's hands stop moving. I have one more question, just one. Haley's jaw tightened. She did not respond, but she also did not remove the microphone. You mentioned earlier that you spent 2 years negotiating with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, Crockett said. You used that experience to suggest my 2 years in Congress made me unqualified to question you. So my question is this. If a congresswoman with access to public financial records and basic arithmetic can discover in 2 weeks that your signature achievement as UN ambassador was built on a number that doesn't exist in any official document, what exactly did Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin discover about you in 2 years of actual negotiations? The silence that followed was total. Haley's hands remained frozen on the microphone. The host's expression showed someone realizing they were witnessing something that would be clipped and shared and analyzed for days. Somewhere off camera, a producer was undoubtedly making frantic decisions about how much of this to let continue before cutting to commercial. 5 seconds. 10. 15. 20. Haley's mouth opened. No words came. She tried again, managed only, before the words died. Her eyes moved from the camera to the host, to her press secretary, seeking any exit that would allow her to leave this moment with dignity intact, and finding none. 23 seconds. Finally, Haley ripped the microphone from her lapel without bothering to unclip it first, stood from the chair with enough force that it rolled backward several inches, and walked directly toward the studio exit. The camera followed her until she disappeared through the door, her press secretary scrambling to gather materials and follow, the host calling after her that they could take a break if she needed a moment. The door closed. The camera cut back to Crockett, who had not moved, her expression showing nothing resembling triumph, only a kind of exhausted resolve. For the record, Crockett said quietly, speaking now directly to the camera, I didn't bring 5 folders. I brought 1 folder with the UN budget documents and 1 folder with her speech transcripts. That was enough. The reason it was enough is that the ambassador built her entire national profile on numbers she couldn't defend when someone finally asked to see the receipts. And that matters. It matters because fiscal responsibility isn't a slogan you get to put on campaign materials. It's a standard you either meet or you don't. Documentation isn't optional. Accuracy isn't partisan. She closed the folders, stacked them neatly. The United States did not reduce UN funding by $800 million during Nikki Haley's tenure. That is not my opinion. That is what every official record shows. And if someone running for president of the United States can spend years claiming credit for savings that didn't happen, and it takes a first-term congresswoman reading the actual budget documents to expose it, then we have a much bigger problem than one fabricated number. She looked directly into the camera. The ambassador said at the beginning of this segment that she wanted to educate me. What she actually did was demonstrate why credentials and experience don't mean anything if they're built on a foundation of numbers you made up. I spent 2 years in Congress. I spent 2 weeks reading UN budget documents. That was all it took to dismantle a decade of her credibility. Not because I'm smarter, not because I'm more experienced, but because I did something she was counting on nobody doing. I checked. The host, recovering slowly from what had just occurred, managed to thank Crockett for her time. The split screen disappeared. The remaining minutes of the segment were filled with awkward analysis and attempts to reach Haley's team for comment, yielding only a terse emailed statement about scheduling conflicts that convinced no one. What the audience did not see Haley in a car 17 minutes later, her phone ringing continuously with calls from campaign staff, donors, and media outlets asking for comment on the clip that was already being shared thousands of times on social media, with timestamps marking the exact moment she went silent. What they did not see? The emergency strategy session that evening where her team tried to construct a response that could contain damage from something that was fundamentally uncontainable, because Crockett had not attacked her with opinions or spin. She had simply read numbers from official documents and asked where the other numbers came from. What the audience did see, shared millions of times in the 72 hours that followed, was a 23-second clip of a woman who had built a career on projecting absolute certainty, unable to speak when asked to produce evidence for her central claim. The silence said everything. It said that the confidence was performance. It said that the credentials were costume. It said that when someone finally asked to see the actual documentation for the $800 million, there was nothing to show. This is not about partisan politics, though it will be framed that way by people who have no other defense available. This is about basic accountability. If you claim documented savings, produce the documents. If you cannot produce the documents, stop claiming they exist. If you spend a decade building a national reputation on numbers that turn out to be fictional, accept that eventually someone will read the actual budget and notice. Nikki Haley opened that interview by questioning Jasmine Crockett's qualifications to discuss foreign policy. She suggested that 2 years in Congress was insufficient experience to understand the complexity of international institutions. But she's not the one who walked off the set. She's not the one who couldn't answer when asked where the $800 million came from. And she's not the one whose signature achievement as UN ambassador turned out to be a number that exists nowhere except in her own speeches. The Congresswoman came to that interview with one folder of budget documents and one folder of transcripts. That was sufficient. That was more than sufficient, because accuracy is not complex. Documentation is not ambiguous. And when someone spends 47 separate occasions claiming credit for the largest spending reduction in UN history, eventually someone will check whether it actually happened. It didn't happen. The records are clear. And the 23 seconds of silence when asked to explain the discrepancy will follow Nikki Haley through every future interview, every campaign appearance, every moment she tries to claim credentials based on fiscal responsibility. Not because Jasmine Crockett destroyed her, but because she destroyed herself the moment she built a career on numbers she couldn't defend when someone finally asked to see the receipts.